Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's training for waiver renewal and service definitions. I'm going to do a quick housekeeping real quick. I just want to make sure that you guys can hear me. So if you can put in the chat and let me know, that would be great. Perfect. Okay. So again, this one, like all others, this will be recorded. And we ask that you guys remain on mute and place your questions in the chat box. After this meeting, there will be a posted Q&A document and the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. It should be located on the webinar page, and I'll post that link in here so you guys can see that as well. Outside of that, I think we're ready to go. And Emily, if you want to kick us off.
Thanks, Beth. Hi, I'm Emily Lubering, and I'm the director for the federal programs. And so I have oversight, or my unit, federal programs unit, has oversight for the waivers and the waiver renewal process and amendment process that we go through for our waivers. And I'm going to start with just we did have a July 11th service definition training, and I did look just recently. I don't believe that recording and that PowerPoint has been posted yet, but we will be getting those up shortly for the 11th, and then we'll also have the 18th posted also. If you want to go to the next slide. So I introduced myself, and then we also have Holly Rafe. She is our director for provider relations. She will give the updates for our assistive technology and for our remote supports changes and out-of-home respite or really temporary residential changes. And then Shelley Brown, our provider relations UDAT technology lead, will be giving updates for our vehicle modifications, or EAA, Environmental Accessibility Adaptations Service. Dwayne Shoemate, our state coordinator for employment and community services, will be providing updates for employment services and specifically around virtual delivery of our services. Lucas Evans, our chief behavior analyst, will be giving updates for our ABA services and virtual delivery of those ABA services. Jessica Bateman, our director of intake, assessment, and utilization review, will give some updates about the UR process and the intake process and our updates to our MOS. And then I will be covering some updates for Kim Stocks, our director of quality programs, for the 2 new value-based incentive payments that we were approved for in this waiver renewal process. Next slide. Thanks. So the Partnership for Hope and Missouri Children's with Developmental Disabilities support waiver renewals renew every 5 years. These home and community-based services, 1915 waivers, the applications have to review at least every 5 years. And the last one we did was in July of 2018. So we were set to renew this year, July 1st of 2023. And CMS approved our Partnership for Hope and MoKids waiver renewals. And we also submitted comprehensive and community support amendments to align all the changes across all 4 waivers. And those were also approved effective July 1st of 2023. And the waiver renewal process starts several years in advance for our waiver, before the waiver renewal. And in the next slide, we'll go over some of those steps that is involved in the waiver renewal process. The actual waiver renewal process starts in advance of the renewal date, and to provide a very quick and high-level timeline, in June of 2021, CMS requested the evidence request report. This is always requested 18 months in advance from CMS prior to the date the waivers are set to renew. What this is CMS requests the state to provide evidence of how the state monitors performance in each of the waivers, as well as the evidence of remediation and improvement activities for all of our waiver assurances or performance measures. So we submit that information to CMS ahead of our renewals, and CMS reviews that, and they do ask us questions about that, and then they approved it for us. The beginning of 2022, in January, the Federal Programs Unit began holding stakeholder sessions to involve all stakeholders in the renewal process, and the division held individual and family, provider, and case management stakeholder sessions to provide an opportunity to voice changes in the waivers. And then March of 2022, FPU began preparing the waiver application documents for the leads for all of the services to review. And then in June of 2022, our draft waiver renewals were posted on our DBD website for a 30-day public comment period. And we had 2 public forum webinars where we explained the changes that were being proposed in the waivers, and then allowed for questions and for our stakeholders. And they could also give feedback through the public comment period. And then we submitted those documents and those waivers to MoHealthNet, our Medicaid agency, for their review. And they went through the process of review with MoHealthNet, and then MoHealthNet post the changes or the applications in January of this year of 2023 for a formal 30-day public comment period. And those comments are also included in our waiver applications, and responses to those comments are included in the waiver application. And then we submit them in March, and then CMS from there has 90 days typically. They can request an extension as well if they need more time to review the applications. And they approved them in June of this year, and with the renewal applications and the amendments being effective July 1 of 2023, the changes in those. So the next slide is our resources, or a few helpful resources, links to the current waiver applications. These are the links to what I think a lot of people refer to as those 300-page documents, the entire applications for each of the waivers. We also have the link to the DD waiver manual, which is often what we use for operations. And that is currently, the updated waiver manual is currently in process and being reviewed, and then going to be submitted to MoHealthNet. And MoHealthNet has to go through a review process and approval before we can publish, or actually MoHealthNet publishes and posts that waiver manual. In the meantime, the Federal Programs Unit is working on a provider bulletin, and those usually don't take quite as long to approve. So we'll get that through the process, be able to put out that provider bulletin of the changes in the waiver while the manual is being reviewed and approved. So that process is in place, or working through the process now currently. So that's an overview of the process for our waiver renewals. And next I'm going to turn it over to Holly, and she's going to talk about the changes with assistive technology in our waiver.
Good afternoon, everyone. So our changes for assistive technology aren't really with our assistive technology definition. They're a separation of services. So our assistive technology is really remaining the same as far as the device, product, or engineered solution that can be purchased commercially, modified, or customized, built for individuals to help support them with their independence and ongoing need. Assistive technology, next slide, please. Assistive technology will still be broken down into 4 components, and they're listed there. Each one of these components have a specific modifier that goes with the A99 assistive technology service support code. So for an example of this is our personal emergency response systems and mobile emergency response systems. Those are assistive technology service delivery supports, and they would have a code of A99UC. Those modifiers that identify the components of remote support are very significant in knowing how our services are growing and being supported. The main difference is now remote supports will have its very own definition, which is what we're going to talk about next. So we've been able to pull the remote support parts of that were part of the assistive technology code service definition into their own waiver service definition to get into a little bit more detail of how that service works. It is still the use of technology to provide supports for an individual through a remote support person Those supports are completed through monitoring of sensors and on demand by the individual. And it too has specific components. So on the next slide, we have also increased the service cap for remote support. So if you guys were familiar, our assistive technology service definition had a $9,000 cap per ISP year, which made it kind of hard to do some remote supports. So with the new definition, we've included a $30,000 cap per ISP year. There is exception available with approval through the regional office director, and the exception form has been updated to include the remote support exception. As I was saying, remote support does include different components. So part of those components are the consultation, which is required from the remote support provider, all equipment and sensors needed to provide the service, support and education on the equipment and services, all software and sensor connections and systems, a response center, and a in-person 20-minute response in case of that emergency that needs that one-on-one live in-person support. As with the response center and the backup person, these supports could range from natural supports to agency paid supports. These would be talked about during the planning process and implementation of service. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about how the difference is with our new remote support definition. Previously, remote support was all-encompassing under the A99 GT code. In our new waiver for remote support, each individual will have at least 2 authorizations, one under A9999 GT and one under A9999 GTSC. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's the equipment code, and that's going to include the purchase or leasing of the equipment, the installation costs, any equipment support and maintenance. What's going to be left behind in the remote support service code is going to include the software, the monitoring system that connects all the sensors to the software, the service itself, which is typically a monthly service fee, and could include that response center. Well, we'll always include the response center, but it may be by a different provider than your remote support provider. In the case that the remote support provider does not have a response center, then that individual is going to see at least 3 different authorizations. A99 GT for the services for the remote support provider, an A99 GT for that response center, and then that A9999 GT SC for all the equipment from that remote support provider. So I know that's a big mouthful, but have no fear because UDAT is still available to have any support that you need with these remote support services. We're going to switch gears next and talk a little bit about our out-of-home respite and temporary residential. The change here is that we're switching the code for temporary residential from the previous T2017 to T1005HX. That HX modifier denotes that it is with the Partnership for Hope waiver. It is still going to be a 15-minute unit, and we've standardized the units and the rate. So there's now a maximum number of units per 24-hour period at 64 15-minute units and a standardized rate of $9.99 per $9.99 per 15-minute unit. On the next slide is just a chart that kind of helps those of us who are visual learners see the difference between those. And I'm now going to turn it over to Shelley Brown to walk us through our home modification and vehicle modifications.
Thanks, Holly. Today I'm going to go through and discuss the changes to the EA waiver definition. And those you can see there on the screen, and we'll go through them here in a little more detail. And while these changes are not significant in application or the use of the service, they do provide additional clarifications in the areas of vehicle maintenance, payment of EAA, provider requirements, and use of service funds for provider-owned or leased vehicle adaptions. So on the next screen, we're going to see where we discuss the maintenance of modification. And the definition reads that vehicle adaptations are specifically excluded that involve regularly scheduled upkeep and maintenance of a vehicle, except when upkeep and maintenance of a modification is funded by the waiver service. So EAA funds may be used for needed maintenance of modification, but for modification only. This cannot be used towards the maintenance or upkeep of the vehicle itself. It's also important to note that the option for maintenance is limited to the modification if the modification was installed by EA funds originally. So if the modification was not installed using EA funds, it is not going to be eligible for EAA supported maintenance for any of those required repairs. On the next screen, we're going to talk about payment of a modified vehicle using EA funds, and this is to be made directly to the contracted dealer or vendor and must be paid directly by the state. So we are not in a position where we can provide funds through an individual or other contracted providers if they do not meet the EAA vehicle modification requirements. So again, those payments do need to be made directly to that contracted provider of the vehicle modification, with the vehicle modification. Our next screen discusses some stipulations in the use of the EAA service. And so as it stated, vehicle accessibility adaptations may not be furnished to adapt vehicles that are owned or leased by providers of waiver services. So as we already know, and we'll just reiterate again, EA funds cannot be used towards the purchase or lease of a vehicle, nor can they be used by waiver service providers for adaptations to provider-owned or provider-leased vehicles, which is very similar to using EAA funds when it comes to home modification as well. And then on our last screen, we updated some clarifications for provider requirements. And those requirements are now that a provider must have applicable business license and technical training or certification and meet applicable vehicle safety codes. So this is something that the training will be evaluated upon submission of application for a contract, or this could be requested by PR through the course of an audit, or maybe any other situation that would require that. So that's just a quick run view of the EA updates. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dwayne for the next one.
All right, thank you, Shelley. So what I'm going to be talking about is virtual delivery of supports. And with virtual delivery of supports, based upon stakeholder feedback in accordance with Missouri's Tech First initiative, the use of virtual delivery of supports is a modality in delivering services, and it has been added to the waiver for employment services, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and behavior analysis services. This will enable best practices established during the public health emergency to continue once the Appendix K flexibilities expire. It is important to note only those services presented today will allow virtual delivery of services, which is the acronym would be VDS. Virtual delivery of services will be stated as an option when reviewing the waiver manual. If there is not a specific reference to virtual delivery of services, virtual delivery of supports, or the acronym VDS in a service definition, then it is not an acceptable modality of service. It is also important to distinguish between virtual delivery of supports and remote supports. Again, virtual delivery of supports is specific to employment, applied behavior analysts, and the speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy services. In order to deliver virtual delivery of supports, the following assurances must be in place. It must be selected by the individual as a preferred modality and aligned with their assessed needs. Secondly, it must be identified as an acceptable or allowable modality in the individual support plan. And third, choice should consider the individual's unique needs. Moving on to the next slide. As far as provider requirements, it is the provider's responsibility to retain consent, demonstrate appropriate training and or capacity to deliver the services, and it is the provider's responsibility to maintain compliance with all HIPAA policies. Text and emails are not considered virtual delivery of supports. To bill for time using virtual delivery supports, it must be a live, non-public facing, real-time platform. And so we will move on to the next slide. In the event of an emergency or need for additional support beyond the capacity of virtual delivery of supports, it is the provider's responsibility and requirements to have a documented backup plan and how an individual's health and safety will be assured. Please note virtual delivery of supports is based on an assessed need and preference of an individual. It is not a choice to be made by a provider for their own convenience, staffing shortage, or staffing patterns. Individuals receiving virtual delivery of support still have the ability to receive in-person services. Remember, this is simply a modality or an option which supports a person's integration, autonomy, and access to services. Again, if virtual delivery supports is not an allowable modality, it will specifically be addressed in the service definition. And moving on to the next page, as noted earlier, when there were limited options during the public health emergency, the innovation and excellence of the individuals supported by the waiver and the providers delivering those services really shined. It was based upon that feedback that spoke to the importance of how technology and virtual delivery supports could be used in meeting an individual's needs. We encourage people to consider virtual delivery supports whenever there are specific limits of providers within a particular service area, when individuals may have difficulties with otherwise accessing supports and services. It should be used as a way to really promote an individual's integration, autonomy, and independence, whether it's within the workplace or in other setting. It can be used to meet as a natural support, and it really should be provided as a continuation of support, or excuse me, not really should be. It could be utilized as a continuation of support when someone may not have ready access to transportation. When billing, virtual delivery supports, the location or place of service code of O2 is what should be used. Specifically to the delivery of employment services, when referencing employment services allowing virtual delivery supports modality, it is specific to benefits planning, career planning, pre-vocational, job development, and supported employment. In addition to the previous assurances, provider requirements shared, it is important to consider the environment where supports would occur. Conditions need to occur, meet the employer's needs if employed, or conducive to a work-based experience. An individual trial as part of an exploration activity within pre-vocational or career planning would be a good use of virtual delivery of supports. Also, one needs to be considering whether or not it's feasible given the job goal and the setting in which the individual would be working. For example, someone working in a daycare may not be able to use if the employer does not allow those in the care to appear on outside video devices, or if someone is working in a loud environment, it may be difficult to utilize virtual delivery of supports. And so with that, one additional slide. As I mentioned, virtual delivery supports is an option for physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. As you can see in the slides, it still needs to meet the same provider requirements that were covered on slides 17 to 20. It needs to meet all the same assurances, and similarly would be billed O2 as place of service if utilizing virtual delivery supports for physical therapy, occupational therapy, or speech therapy. And with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to Lucas.
Thanks, Dwayne. Hello, everybody. I'm going to cover quickly the changes to the applied behavior analysis services. So as some of you may be aware, ABA services have been eligible for virtual delivery of service since 2019. And so this is more of just clarifying that these services will continue to be eligible. I have up here on the screen the specific services associated with ABA that can be used virtually. You'll notice that 97153 is not on here, so that's the adaptive behavior treatment by technician, and also the exposure services are not eligible, so that's the exposure assessment and exposure treatment. But all these are able to be provided virtually, provided there's clinical rationale and it makes sense. So continuing on to the next slide. Again, this has been an option since 2019. But what you, and you may or may not remember that prior to COVID, there was a requirement if providing ABA virtually that at least 25% of the service had to be provided in person. Now, obviously, when COVID happened and the Appendix K flexibilities became active, that in-person requirement went away. And so one of the things that has changed is we're going to continue with that up to 100% virtual option for all of those eligible services. Let's do the previous slide when you get the copy. So you can, an individual can receive 100% of those services virtually, provided that they clinically make sense for that person. So this is the same stuff that Dwayne just covered, but you've got to have a policy and plan for how you're going to actually provide it virtually, including some emergency contingency plans. And so for ABA services specifically, it's not just a contingency plan in the event that the technology doesn't work that day, but what happens if the individual who is receiving virtual, it becomes clear that virtual is not appropriate anymore. And so you need to transition to in-person services. So those sorts of contingency plans are necessary. You've got to have clinical documentation about why this makes sense for the person, why it's good or beneficial for them, not what's convenient for the provider. So it can't be a strategy that a provider utilizes to reduce the cost of travel or to see more clients so they don't have to travel as far. It really needs to be about what's good for the person. Again, this is what Dwayne just said, but I think it's important just to keep mentioning it. And my team will continue to monitor the utilization of ABA services. Specifically for the virtual option, we'll be looking at those individuals who have received the majority or high utilization of virtual delivery, specifically those people who are also experiencing high risk outcomes. So they're, for example, going to the emergency room or getting frequently or experiencing lots of restraints, in which case the level of restrictiveness that they're experiencing or the level of outcomes they're experiencing seems to be potentially a mismatch with the delivery of the service virtually. So we'll be looking for those and we'll follow up as needed. This really isn't a change. The only thing that's really a change here is that we're not monitoring the 25% rule previously. We're just monitoring the use of virtual delivery of service for ABA. So this is basically the same. It just removes that 25% in-person requirement and makes it consistent with how it's been operating with Appendix K. So we feel like this is going to continue to allow individuals maximal ability to access clinical services. So we think this is a good thing. So next slide, please. In addition to the virtual delivery of services, there's been some limit changes as well for a few codes. So specifically for the assessment codes, 97151 has been increased from 8 units in a year to 32. This is one that folks had previously or frequently indicated as being just too low to reasonably use. So we have raised it to align ourselves with HealthNet, who also recently made some changes to limits. So we are in alignment with 32 units per year for 97151 HO, and then also for the supporting assessment, 97152, all the modifiers increases across day and year. So from 10 units in a day to 16, the weekly limit remains the same at 50, but the yearly limit has been increased from 50 to 100. So some significant changes to limits for these codes. So we're really excited about that. We're hopeful that that meets some of the needs of providers in the community. And it makes us consistent with HealthNet, which is always a good thing. So we appreciate that. And next slide, please. And then the only other thing that has changed, again, this is to bring us in alignment with HealthNet and also private insurance, is for the adaptive treatment by protocol by technician, the 97153. We have added the ability for the HO modifier, so the QHCP, to be able to bill that and provide that service. Previously, if a QHCP provided the service, they would have to bill it an HN or an HM. This was indicated as kind of a barrier to some of our providers, and it also is out of alignment with HealthNet and other insurers. So we have added HO to 97153. So if this impacts you, hopefully this is a good change. If it doesn't impact you, then you are now informed. So hopefully these things are helpful. Again, we always appreciate feedback on what we can do differently, but I think these changes are pretty positive and look forward to seeing what folks experience with them as they get going. you all want me to answer questions now or wait?
We'll answer them in the Q&A, unless there's any glaring, something that really has to be answered.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to the next person.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jess Bateman, and I am the Director of Intake, Assessment, and UR. And I will be sharing a few updates pertaining to assessment and utilization review. On March 31st, CSR did update, and that update had some impact to the eligibility process, which includes a new transformative assessment tool, which is the Missouri Adaptive Ability Scale, most commonly referred to as MAS. MAS is the standard preemptive or preliminary instrument for determining substantial functional limitations. MAS doesn't just measure that, however, it also will simultaneously provide a priority of need and rate allocation score. So it is very transformative, comprehensive, and we're very excited and proud of it. In fact, it is the first comprehensive norm reference and standardized assessment that meets all of the criteria outlined in state, federal, and DSM-5 criteria. So, next slide, please. The UR process updated to reflect the implementation of MAS as the standard assessment tool for substantial functional limitations, but it also refined the utilization review process. Previously, UR was completed by a committee composed of multiple subject matter experts, and that committee would review the proposed ISP and collectively make a recommendation to the regional office for the director to approve, modify, or deny the requested services. But now the UR process is completed by a distinguished subject matter expert known as a UR coordinator or UR chair. Additionally, the regional office director is able to designate individuals like the UR coordinator to review and approve requests on behalf of the regional office director. So the UR process has also been transformed and streamlined as well. So that concludes the assessment and UR portion. Thank you for your attention and all that you do. And I will turn it to Kim Stocks to present on value-based payments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. This is Emily. I'm going to step in for Kim because she can't join us today, but I'll go over the two new value-based payments that were approved in the waiver. The first one is to establish an incentive payment for our waiver service providers of residential services that have a agency assigned HRSA rater. And that rater, that agency assigned HRSA rater, can complete the Missouri Person-Centered Thinking training, complete that training, and receive the agency receives a payment for completion of that training. And then I think there's some more. Yeah. Okay. So why was this incentive put in place? To incentivize our HRSA residential rater staff to complete the Missouri Person-Centered Thinking training, and the payment can be earned and paid to the residential service provider organization who, with the designated residential HRSA rater staff. It's a one-time payment of $840 to the residential service provider for that HRSA rater to complete the training. Payments start beginning October 1st of 2023. And for any designated training completed prior to the end of our state fiscal year 2024. So that's June 30th of 2024. And the training can be completed in the designated MO-PCT training in the Intellectability electronic system, and it does require a one-day virtual class component. Agency reporting to request the VBP will to report the request this VBP payment, you would put that information into REDCap, which is like all of our other VBP incentives. On the next slide is the second VBP payment, and that is to establish an incentive payment for our waiver service providers of residential services. Again, for the agency assigned Mo Hurst Rader to complete the electronic advanced Fatal 5 Plus training in the inelectability system. And this information will help the Hurst Rater with identification of implementation strategies to mitigate risk, improve health outcomes, and support the individual waiver participant in health and welfare. On the next slide. So this is, again, this is to incentivize our Hurst Raters to staff to complete the advanced Fatal 5 Plus training. It's a payment that's earned and paid to the residential service provider. The one-time payment for completion of that training is $438. And payments start on October 1st of 2023 for the designated training completed prior to the end of the state fiscal year 2024. Again, that's June 30th of 2024. And this training can also be completed in our inelectability electronic system and recorded in REDCap as well. So that concludes all of our changes in our waivers, service definition training in our waivers. For questions, additional questions, we will be answering chat questions through our question and response document that will be posted on our website with these trainings. And any additional questions that you're not able to put into chat today, or if you think of later around these changes in our waivers, you can email those questions to our DD mail box at ddmail@dmh.mo.gov. And we'll get those waiver service definition change questions, and we'll also include those in the question and answer document that we'll be posting. So I appreciate your time today, and watch our previous webinar page for the posted recording, the PowerPoint presentation, and also the question and answer document. There's also linked on that webpage is our programmatic change chart. Essentially, it goes over the changes that we went over today too, but in a spreadsheet format, which may be different if that's kind of how you like to look at changes versus the PowerPoint changes. So thank you for joining today.